I want to thank you very sincerely for this invitation to speak here at the 12th Symposium of Gileadian Studies. And I wish, as the title of my little chat implies, to consider some of the problems associated with the soi-disant manuscript, which is well known to all of you now, and which goes by the name of The Handmaid's Tale. I say soi-disant because what we have before us is not the item in its original form. Strictly speaking, it was not a manuscript at all when first discovered, and of course bore no title. The superscription, The Handmaid's Tale, appended to it by Professor Wade. And that was very much Wade's homage to the great Geoffrey Chaucer. But those of you who know Professor Wade informally, as I do, will understand when I say that I'm sure that all puns were intentional, particularly that having to do with the archaic, vulgar signification of the word tale, that being, to some extent, the bone, as it were, of contention in that phase of Gileadian society of which our saga treats. This item, then, I hesitate to use the word document, was unearthed on the site of what was once the city of Bangor, in what at the time prior to the inception of the Gileadian regime would have been the state of Maine. We know that this city was a prominent way station on what our author refers to as the Underground Female Road, since dubbed by some of our historical wags the Underground Frail Road. Now, for this reason, our association has taken a particular interest in it. The item, in its pristine state, consisted of a metal footlocker, US Army issue, circa perhaps 1955. Now, this fact of itself need have no significance, as it is known that such footlockers were frequently sold as army surplus and must therefore have been widespread. Within this locker, which was sealed with tape of the kind once used on packages to be sent by post, were approximately 30 tape cassettes of the type that became obsolete sometime in the 80s or the 1990s with the advent of the compact disc. And I should remind you, of course, that this was not the first such discovery. You are doubtless familiar, for instance, with the item known as the AB Memoirs, located in a garage in a suburb of Seattle, and also with the so-called Diary of P, excavated by accident during the erection of a new meeting house in the vicinity of what was once Syracuse in New York. Professor Wade and I were very excited by this new discovery, and luckily we had several years before, with the aid of our excellent resident antiquarian technician, reconstructed a machine capable of playing such tapes, and we immediately set about the painstaking work of transcription. There were, as I say, some 30 tapes in the collection altogether, with varying proportions of music to spoken word. In general, each tape begins with 2 or 3 songs, as camouflage, no doubt, and then the music is broken off and the speaking voice takes over. The voice is a woman's, and according to our voice print experts, the same one throughout. The labels of the cassettes were authentic period labels, dating, of course, from some time before the inception of the early Gilead era, as all such secular music was banned under the regime. There were, for instance, 4 tapes entitled Elvis Presley's Golden Years, 3 of Folk Songs of Lithuania, 3 of Boy George Takes It Off, and 2 of Mantovani's mellow strings, as well as some titles that sported a mere single tape each. And Twisted Sister at Carnegie Hall is one of which I am particularly fond. Although the labels were authentic, they were not always appended to the tape with the corresponding songs, and in addition, the tapes were arranged in no particular order, being loose at the bottom of the locker, nor were they numbered. Thus it was up to Professor Wade and myself to arrange the blocks of speech in order in which they appeared to go, but as I've said elsewhere, all such arrangements are based on some guesswork and are to be regarded as approximate pending further research. And I'm pleased to say that I have 2 current doctoral students who are rethinking the order of the tapes, and that's to our benefit. Once we had the transcription in hand, and we had to go over it several times, owing to the difficulties posed by, for instance, the accent, very obscure references and archaisms, we had to make some decision as to the nature of the material which we had so laboriously acquired, and several possibilities confronted us. First, the tapes might be a forgery. As you know, there have been several instances of such forgeries for which publishers have paid very large sums, wishing to trade no doubt on the sensationalism of the stories. After all, it appears that certain periods of history quickly become, both for other societies and for those that follow them, the stuff of not especially edifying legend, and the occasion for a good deal of hypocritical self-congratulation. If I may be permitted an editorial aside here, allow me to say that in my opinion, we must be cautious about passing moral judgment upon the Gileadians. Surely we have learned by now that such judgments are of necessity culture specific. Also, Gileadian society was under a good deal of pressure, demographic and otherwise, and was subject to factors from which we ourselves are happily more free. Our job is not to censure, but to understand. To return then from my digression, tape like this, however, is very difficult to fake convincingly. And we are assured by the experts who examined them that the physical objects themselves are genuine. Certainly the recording itself, that is, the superimposition of voice upon a music tape, could not have been done within the past 150 years. Supposing then that the tapes are genuine, what of the nature of the account itself? Obviously, it could not have been recorded during the period of time it recounts, since if the author is telling the truth, no machine or tapes would have been available to her, nor would she have had a place of concealment for them. Also, there is a certain reflective quality about the narrative that would, at least to my mind, rule out synchronicity. For me, the narrative, it has a kind of a whiff of emotions recalled, if not in tranquility, at least in post facto. If we could establish an identity for the narrator, we felt, we might well be on the way to an explanation of how this document, and I will call it document for the sake of brevity, came into being. And to do this, we tried 2 lines of investigation. First, we attempted, through old town plans of Bangor and other remaining documentation, to identify the inhabitants of the house that must have occupied the site of the discovery at about that time. Possibly, we reasoned, This house may have been a safe house on the underground female road during our period, and our author may have been kept hidden in, for instance, the attic or the cellar there for some weeks or some months, during which she would have had the opportunity to make the recordings. Of course, there was nothing to rule out the possibility that the tapes had been moved to the site in question after they had been made. We hope to be able to trace and locate the descendants of the hypothetical occupants, whom we hoped might lead us to other material, diaries perhaps, family anecdotes passed down through the generations, and so forth. Unfortunately, this trail led us nowhere. Possibly these people, if they had indeed been a link to the underground chain, had been discovered and arrested, in which case any documentation referring to them would have been destroyed. So we pursued a second line of attack. We searched records of the period, trying to correlate known historical personages with the individuals who appear in our author's account. Now, the surviving records of the time are, as you know, spotty, as the Gileadian regime was in the habit of wiping its own computers and destroying printouts after various purges and internal upheavals. But some printouts remain. Some, indeed, were smuggled to England for propaganda use by the various Save the Women societies, of which there were very many in the British Isles at the time. We held out no hope of tracing the narrator herself directly. It was clear from the internal evidence that she was among the first wave of women recruited for reproductive purposes and allotted to those who both required such services and could lay claim to them through the position of being in the elite. The regime created an instant pool of such women by the simple tactic of declaring all second marriages and non-marital liaisons adulterous, arresting the female partners and, on the grounds that they were morally unfit, confiscating the children they already had, who were then adopted by childless couples of the upper echelons who were eager for progeny by any means. And you'll recall, of course, that in the middle period, this policy was extended to cover all marriages not contracted within the state church. Men highly placed in the regime were thus able to pick and choose among women who had demonstrated their reproductive fitness by having produced one or more healthy children, a desirable characteristic in an age of plummeting Caucasian birth rates, a phenomenon observable not only in Gilead, but in most northern Caucasian societies at the time. Now, the reasons for this decline are not altogether clear to us. Some of the failure to reproduce can undoubtedly be traced to the widespread availability of birth control of various kinds, including abortion, in the immediate pre-Gilead period. Some infertility then was willed, which may account for the different statistics among Caucasians and non-Caucasians, but the rest was not. Need I remind you that this was the age of the R-strain syphilis and also of the infamous AIDS epidemic, which, once they spread into the population at large, eliminated many young sexually active people from the reproductive pool. Stillbirths, miscarriages, and genetic deformities were widespread and on the increase, and this trend has been linked to the various nuclear plant accidents, shutdowns, and incidents of sabotage that characterized the period, as well as to leakages from chemical and biological warfare stockpiles and toxic waste disposal sites, of which there were many thousands, both legal and illegal. In some instances, these materials were simply dumped into sewage systems, and to the uncontrolled use also of chemical insecticides, herbicides, and other sprays. But whatever the causes, the effects were noticeable, and the Gilead regime was not the only one to react to them at the time. Romania, for instance, had anticipated Gilead in the 80s by banning all forms of birth control, imposing compulsory pregnancy tests on the female population, and linking promotion and wage increases to fertility. The need for what I may call birth services was already recognized in the pre-Gilead period, where it was being inadequately met by artificial insemination, fertility clinics, and the use of surrogate mothers who were hired for the purpose. Gilead outlawed the first two as irreligious, but legitimized and enforced the third, which was considered to have biblical precedence. Thus, they replaced the serial polygamy common in the pre-Gilead period with the older form of simultaneous polygamy practiced both in the early Old Testament times and in the former state of Utah in the 19th century. As we know from the study of history, no new system can impose itself upon a previous one without incorporating many of the elements to be found in the latter, as witness the pagan elements in medieval Christianity and the evolution of the Russian KGB from the Tsarist secret service that preceded it. And Gilead was no exception to this rule. Its racist policies, for instance, were firmly rooted in pre-Gilead period, and racist fears provided some of the emotional fuel that allowed the Gilead takeover to succeed as well as it did. Our author, then, was one of many, and must be seen within the broad outlines of the moment in history of which she was part. But what else do we know about her apart from her age, some physical characteristics that could be anyone's, and her place of residence? Not very much. She appears to have been an educated woman, insofar as a graduate of any North American college of the time may be said to be educated. But the woods, as we say, are full of those, so that's no help. She does not see fit to supply us with her original name, and indeed all official records of it would have been destroyed upon her entry into the Rachel and Leah Re-Education Centre. Offred gives us no clue, since like Off-Glen and Off-Warren, it was a patronymic composed of the possessive preposition and the first name of the gentleman in question, and such names were taken by these women upon their entry into a connection with the household of a specific commander and relinquished by them upon leaving it. The other names in the document are equally useless for our purposes of identification and authentication. Luke and Nick drew blanks, as did Moira and Janine. There is a high probability that these were in any case pseudonyms adopted to protect those individuals should the tapes be discovered. If so, this would substantiate our view that the tapes were made inside the borders of Gilead rather than outside, to be smuggled back for use by the Mayday underground. Elimination of the above possibilities left us with one remaining. If we could identify the elusive commander, we felt at least some progress would have been made. We argued that such a highly placed individual had probably been a participant in the first of the top-secret Sons of Jacob think tanks, at which the philosophy and the social structure of Gilead were hammered out. These were organized shortly after the recognition of the superpowers' arms stalemate and the signing of the classified Spheres of Influence Accord, which left the superpowers free to deal unhampered by interference with the growing number of rebellions within their own empires. The official records of the Sons of Jacob meetings were, of course, destroyed after the Middle Period Great Purge, which discredited and liquidated a number of the original architects of Gilead. We have access to some information through the diary kept in cipher by Wilfred Limpkin, one of the sociobiologists present. And as we know, the sociobiological theory of natural polygamy was used as a scientific justification for some of the older practices of the regime, just as Darwinism was used by earlier ideologies. The Limpkin material, we knew that there were two possible candidates. That is, two whose names incorporated the Fred element. There was Frederick R. Waterford and B. Frederick Judd. Limpkin describes the latter as a stuffed shirt, and I quote, "Somebody for whom foreplay is what you do on a golf course." Now, Limpkin himself did not, of course, long survive the inception of Gilead, and we have his diary only because he foresaw his own end and placed it with his sister-in-law in Calgary. Waterford and Judd both have characteristics that recommend them to us. Waterford possesses a background in market research and was, at least according to Limpkin, was responsible for the design of the female costumes and for the suggestion that the handmaids wear red, which he seems to have borrowed from the uniforms of German prisoners of war in Canadian POW camps of the Second World War era of the 20th century. Fred Waterford seems to have been the originator of the term particulation, which he lifted from an exercise program popular sometime in the last third of the century. The collective rape ceremony, however, was suggested by an English village custom of the 17th century. Salvaging may also have been his too, although by the time of Gilead's inception, it had spread from its origin in the Philippines to become a general term for the elimination of one's political enemies. And as I've said elsewhere, there was very little that was truly original with or indigenous to Gilead. Its genius was synthesis. Now, Judd, on the other hand, seems to have been less interested in packaging and more concerned with tactics. It was he who suggested the use of an obscure CIA pamphlet on the destabilization of foreign governments as a strategic handbook for the Sons of Jacob, and he too who drew up the early list of hits of prominent Americans of the time. He is also suspected of having orchestrated the President's Day massacre, which must have required maximum infiltration of the security system surrounding Congress, and without which the Constitution could never have been suspended. The national homelands and the Jewish boat person plans were both his, as was the idea of privatizing the Jewish repatriation scheme, with the result that more than one boatload of Jews was simply dumped into the Atlantic to maximize profits. From what we know of Judd, this would not have bothered him very much. He was a hardliner and is credited by Limpkin with the remark, I quote, "Our big mistake was teaching them to read. We won't do that again." It is Judd who is credited with devising the form, as opposed to the name, of the particulation ceremony, arguing that it was not only a particularly horrifying and effective way of ridding yourself of subversive elements, But, he went on, that it would also act as a stream valve for the female elements in Gilead. Scapegoats have been notoriously useful throughout history, and must have been most gratifying for those handmaids, so rigidly controlled at other times, to be able to tear a man apart with their bare hands every once in a while. So popular and effective did this practice become that it was regularized in the Middle Gileadian period, when it took place 4 times a year, on solstices and equinoxes. There are echoes here, I think, of the fertility rites of early earth goddess cults. As we heard at the panel discussion yesterday afternoon, Gilead was, although undoubtedly patriarchal in form, occasionally matriarchal in content, like some sectors of the social fabric that gave rise to it. As the architects of Gilead knew, to institute an effective totalitarian regime, or indeed any system at all, you must offer some benefits and freedoms, at least to a privileged few, in return for those that you remove. In this connection, a few comments here upon the crack female control agency known as the aunts is perhaps in order. Judd, according to the Limpkin material, was of the opinion from the outset that the best and most cost-effective way to control women for reproductive and other purposes was through women themselves. For this, there are many historical precedents. In fact, no empire imposed by force or otherwise has ever been without this feature. Control of the indigenous members of their own group. In the case of Gilead, there were many women willing to serve as aunts, either because of a genuine belief in what they called traditional values, or for the benefits they might thereby acquire. When power is source, a little of it is tempting. There was, too, a negative inducement. Childless or infertile or older women who were not married could take service in the aunts and thereby escape redundancy and consequent shipment to the infamous colonies, which were composed of portable populations used mainly as expendable toxic cleanup squads, although if lucky you could be assigned to less hazardous tasks such as cotton picking and fruit harvesting. The idea then was Judd's, but the implementation has the mark of Waterford upon it. Who else amongst the sons of Jacob think tankers would have come up with the notion that the aunts should take names derived from commercial products available to women in the immediate pre-Gilead period, and thus become familiar and reassuring to them, the names of cosmetic lines, cake mixes, frozen desserts, and even medicinal remedies. It was a brilliant stroke, and confirms us, in our opinion, that Waterford was, in his prime, a man of considerable ingenuity. But there again, so in his own way was Judd. Now, both of these gentlemen were known to have been childless and thus eligible for a succession of handmaids. Professor Wade and I have speculated in our joint monograph the notion of seed in early Gilead that both, like many of the commanders, had come in contact with sterility-causing virus that was developed by pre-Gilead gene splicing experiments with mumps, and which was intended for insertion into the supply of caviar used by top officials in Moscow. The experiment, of course, was abandoned after the spheres of influence accord because the virus was considered too uncontrollable and therefore too dangerous by many, although some wished to sprinkle it over the entire Indian continent. However, neither Judd nor Waterford was married to a woman who was ever or had ever been known as either Pam or as Serena Joy. Now, this latter appears to have been a somewhat malicious invention by our author. Judd's wife's name was Bambi May, and Waterford's was Thelma. The latter had, however, once worked as a television personality of the type described. We know this from Limpkin, who makes several snide remarks about it, and the regime took pains to cover up such former lapses from the unorthodoxy by the spouses of its elite. So the evidence on the whole favours Waterford. We know, for instance, that he met his end probably soon after the events our author describes in one of the earliest purges. He was accused of liberal tendencies, of being in possession of a substantial and unauthorized collection of heretical pictorial and literary materials, and of harboring a subversive. This was before the regime began holding its trials in secret and was still televising them. So the events were recorded in England via satellite and are on videotape deposit in our archives. The shots of Waterford are not always good, but this one here is quite haunting, I think, and clear enough to establish what he looked like. As for the subversive Waterford was accused of harbouring, this could have been Offred herself, as her flight would have placed her in this category. More likely, though, it was Nick, who, by the evidence of the very existence of the tapes, must have helped Offred to escape. The way in which he was able to do this marks him as a member of the shadowy Mayday underground, which was not identical with the underground female road, but certainly had connections with it. The latter was purely a rescue operation, the former quasi-military. A number of Mayday operatives are known to have infiltrated the Gileadian power structure at the highest level, and the placement of one of these members as a chauffeur to Waterford would certainly have been a coup. A double coup, in fact, as Nick must have been at the same time a member of the Eyes, as some chauffeurs and personal servants often were. Waterford would, of course, have been aware of this, but as all high-level commanders were automatically directors of the Eyes, he would not have paid a great deal of attention to it and would not have let it interfere with his infraction of what he considered to be minor rules. Like most early Gilead commanders who were later purged, he considered his position to be above attack. The style of Middle Gilead was certainly more cautious. This is our guesswork. Supposing it to be correct, supposing that is, that Waterford was indeed the commander, many gaps remain. Some of them could have been filled by our anonymous author had she had a different turn of mind. She could have told us much about the workings of the Gileadian Empire, had she had the instincts of a reporter or a spy. What we would not give now for even 20 pages or so of printout from Waterford's private computer. However, we must be grateful for any crumbs that the goddess of history has deigned to vouchsafe us. As for the ultimate fate of our narrator, of course it remains obscure. Was she smuggled over the border of Gilead into what was then Canada, and did she make her way thence to England? This would have been wise, as the Canada of that time did not wish to antagonize its powerful neighbor, and there were roundups and extraditions of such refugees. If so, why did she not take her taped narrative with her? Perhaps her journey was sudden. Perhaps she feared interception. On the other hand, she may have been recaptured. If she did indeed reach England, why did she not make her story public, as so many of them did upon reaching the outside world? She may have feared retaliation against Luke, supposing him to have been still alive, which is a huge improbability. or even against her daughter. For the Gileadian regime was not above such measures and used them to discourage adverse publicity in foreign countries. And more than one incautious refugee was known to receive a hand, ear, or foot vacuum-packed express hidden in, for instance, a tin of coffee. Or perhaps she was among those escaped handmaids who had difficulty adjusting to life on the outside world once they got there, after their protective existence which they had led. She may have become then something of a recluse. We simply do not know. We can only deduce also the motivations for Nick's engineering of her escape. We can assume that once her companion Offglen's association with Mayday had been discovered, he himself was in some jeopardy, for as he well knew, as a member of the Eyes, Offred herself was certain to be interrogated. The penalties for unauthorized sexual activity with a handmaid were severe. Nor would his status as an Eye necessarily protect him. Gileadian society was Byzantine in the extreme, and any transgression might be used against one by one's undeclared enemies within the regime. He could, of course, have assassinated her himself, which might have been the wiser course. But the human heart remains a factor, and as we know, both of them thought she might be pregnant by him. After all, what male of the Gilead period could resist the possibility of fatherhood, so redolent of status, so highly prized? Indeed, he called in a rescue team of Eyes who may or may not have been authentic, but in any case were under his orders. In doing so, he may well have brought about his own downfall. This too we shall never know. So, did our narrator reach the outside world safely and build a new life for herself? Or was she discovered in her attic hiding place, arrested, sent to the colonies, or to Jezebel's, or even executed? Our document, though it's in its own way eloquent, is on these subjects mute. We may call Eurydice forth from the world of the dead, but we cannot make her answer. And when we turn to look at her, we glimpse her only for a moment before she slips from our grasp and flees. As all historians know, the past is a great darkness and filled with echoes. Voices may reach us from it, but what they say to us is imbued with the obscurity of the matrix out of which they came. And try as we may, we cannot always decipher them precisely in the clearer light of our own day. Take this opportunity to thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions or to discuss any issues that you may have. Thank you very much.